Hi guys, I'm Jim and this is Jim's Fix-It Shop. And today this is a response to a email I've got off of a video I did on repairing a rusty mower deck. And they wrote in and told me that when we repair rusty mower decks, we take the spindles and the spindle housings apart. And because in my video I mentioned that I had broke some of these bolts off. If you're worried about doing that, don't. They're not that hard to get out. There's a lot of neighbors. I have a few neighbors here that has mills and shops in their garages or basements that would be more than happy to take them out for you. There's a lot of little job shops around, like ours, the one I work in. We have people that come in and say, hey, you know, I've got this problem with a mower deck or a problem with water meters. And we fix a lot of stuff for people. I got this broken tap or whatever. You know, can you help me out? We're more than happy to do it. I say, drop it off, come back tomorrow, and I'll fix it for you. We do a lot of stuff for the area that our shop is in for, it's Roosevelt Park. We do a lot of work for them. And now they're a customer. They bring stuff to us all the time. You never know when a guy off the street that you're helping out next week might be your biggest customer. You just don't know. But today we're going to take a look at these mower deck spindles and housings. And I'm going to explain to you what he said that they do, and I guess why I wouldn't do it that way. But hey, we're all different. We all do things different, and that's just the way it is, you know. So let me take this apart the way I did it in my video. Then I took the bolts out, and I took this housing out of the mower deck. I sent it out. I had it commercially sandblasted and commercially powder coated. Now, if you have your own sandblaster and you're really careful, you could do that this way. But they take the bearings out, takes the spindle out, and they take the bearings out. Now, I'll explain to you why this isn't good in a minute as far as how this came apart. But if you were going to sandblast this mower deck with these housings in it yourself and paint it yourself, that would probably be fine. But you take this to a commercial sandblaster that's pushing over 200 psi with an 1.5 or 2-inch hose. I mean, these guys have some equipment. This is aluminum. He could probably totally eat this away sandblasting your mower deck. Now these bores where the bearings supposed to be pressed into, these were not. There's a small little ridge in here. That's the seat where the bearing is supposed to seat against. And the same on the bottom. There's a seat in there. If you hit that with a sandblaster and distort it, your bearings are not going to line up right, and you're going to burn the bearings out. Now these bearings slip in there very easy. That is not good. The bottom one is the same way. And then yours goes on. No, I'm sorry. This is a spacer. It goes in first. Then that goes on. Then this goes on. Then, you know, we're going to have to put this on. Then the nut goes on. He said they tear it apart that way so they can check the bearings and make sure they're good. Well, in this case, you can tell these bearings aren't any good. Well, just by listening to it. That is not good. You can usually tell if your spindle are bad when you're mowing your grass. You'll hear that. Over top the engine, you can hear that. Another way to check it is just try to wiggle it. That slop, that's not good. I have side play, that's not good. You don't have to tear it apart to check that. When you do tear these apart, you need some bearing tools. I have a few of mine on the bench. Here's the tools that we call nut crackers. They're for pulling bearings off of spindles. I'll show you how that works in a second. Here's some of the wheel pullers I use and bearing pullers. Here's a 2-finger one. These are 3, or you can change them into 2. This is a sliding hammer. This is made for pulling bearings out of a housing. Now, if that was pressed in there the way it's supposed to be, there's no way to really get a hold of that when you got a bearing in the bottom in your way. So you use one of these sliding hammers. They have fingers on there with teeth on them. They go down in the inner race. You tighten this up and it grabs on the inner race of the bearing. You slide the hammer up and it jerks the bearing out, just like this is doing. The problem with that, if this was a good bearing and I pulled it out of there like that to see if it was any good, you're pulling against the inner race. Your outer race is pressed into your housing. So now you're banging against the inner race, which is transferring the force of that to the balls, which are transferring the force to the outer race. And every time you hit it, you're denting something in there. Either the inner race, your outer race, or the balls now have dents in them. Now you start spinning this at high speed, you're going to burn your bearing up. You don't want to do that. Now this is a case where we use these nut crackers. Let me turn you back around here. This one's a little big for this situation, but the only one that's unbolted. You take this off and you take a look at it. See how thin this is? That's to get in between the head of the spindle and the bearing. Then you slide these things together with that in there like that. You put it in a press. You bolt these together so that it's tight. You put it in a press and you can push that down without hurting this bearing. These have a slight curve to them. They're not totally flat. That way when you go in here, you're catching on the inner race and you can push that bearing out without hurting it. I do this at work. I know what I'm talking about. Now if you were going to put these bearings in this housing, let's say you had it sandblasted and now this is how your bearings fit. They're loose. If you could watch this when it's spinning, you would be able to see that outer race as this thing is spinning at whatever these decks spin at. That outer race is going to slowly be turning in this casting, which is going to wear the casting out even more. And it's just going to let it turn more and more to the point where your casting is now a shot. So when you put these together and it slips in like that loose, this is what you want to use. It's Loctite 609. It's a bearing mounting material. It's not like thread locker. You put a little bit of this on the outside of the bearing, just smear it around with your finger, and you slide it in there. Now you want to let all this stuff set for 24 hours so it sets up and locks that outer race. Then it won't slip on you. Now you're going to put the bearing on here. This should be a press fit. So you do the same thing. You put your bearing mount on this shaft, you slide it up on there and you assemble it, you let it sit for 24 hours. Now to buy this stuff, I gotta find my card. I guess I'm gonna have to look for it. Don't you just love pause? Okay, this is where I get my bearings for home, my personal use, and work. In the tool and die shop I work at, I do all the machine repair and maintenance work. We used to build a lot of spindles. I used to rebuild a lot of high-speed spindles. I'm not talking about a $20 bearing for a mower deck. I'm talking about $500 and $600 bearings for spindles, high-speed precision bearings. That's what I've worked with a lot before. The machines we're buying today are all CNC controlled, very expensive. The spindles are built in what they call a cartridge. You can't get them apart. They're sealed. You can't buy bearings for them. They're all German-made machines. And now instead of putting either 2 or 4 high-speed precision bearings for anywhere from $500 to $700 a piece, now we're paying $5,000 for a spindle cartridge. I guess they figured out how to make more money out of us. But this is where I buy my bearings. I asked them if I could give their name. It used to be Detroit Ball Bearing, now it's Applied. I'll have their phone number in the description. I asked them, I said, well, can I use your name? They said, why not? It's free advertising. They have a website. They have a 1-800 toll-free phone number. You can buy bearings from them and they'll ship them to you. They also warned me about something I didn't know. They told me don't buy bearings off the internet. Whether it's, it's a couple of them. I don't buy much of anything off the internet. eBay and what's the other one? Sorry, I just don't use the internet. I'm old school. But they told me that China is producing some very low quality bearings, putting brand names on them and selling them on the internet. And he said they don't last. They're burning up, they rattle. They're darn near as bad as this one when they're brand new. And by the way, see how nice that spins? I can get my finger in it and hold it. That's not a good bearing. That is not a good bearing. This one, it's hard to hold them by the inner race. Now when I let go of that, it made about another half a turn once I let go from spinning it. That is a brand new bearing. Now, another thing on leaving this in your mower deck. If you have it powder coated, if you spray paint it yourself, wrap some masking tape on the inside of this bore. You can't get paint on that or your bearing ain't going to fit. From 0 to 1 inch diameter, you have to have a 1/1000th of an inch press. That means this hole is going to be 1/1000th of an inch smaller than the OD of this bearing. The bigger the bearing, the more press that you're going to have. If you have this powder coated, okay, let's say we commercially sandblast it and they stay away from these bores. They're smart enough to know, hey, we can't blast this aluminum out of here. But they send it over to a powder coater and he powder coats it. And he gets powder in there. So, and then it bakes on as paint. You're never going to get your bearing in. The powder coat's very thick compared to paint. If you do try to press it in without scraping that powder coat out, and I don't know if you ever tried to scrape powder coat, but you can barely sandblast that stuff. It's so hard. If somehow you do press that bearing in there and you shove all that paint down up against that lip, that's going to separate these bearings farther apart than they're supposed to be. So when you put this together, you have a bearing on the bottom. And that goes in up against that bottom lip. Tight, like that. Then you have a spacer that goes in there. This spacer is within 1/1000th in length as these two shoulders are apart. So you drop that in there. Then you drop this bearing in there. It's going to sit in that shoulder and on that spacer within 1/1000th. Then you're going to put this spacer on top that's going to push against the inner races. And then you put the nut on. It's going to pinch all this together. If them fits aren't the same within 1/1000ths, you're going to put a load on these bearings. They're going to heat up and they're going to burn up. All these fits are all manufactured in within certain tolerances, so they work right. So I hope I've helped you out a little bit more than just confuse the heck out of you. Myself, if I do it, I take these out. It's just simpler. If they're not making a bunch of noise like this one does, I'm not going to tear them apart and risk damaging the bearing just so I don't worry about breaking them bolts off. I'll put the phone number and name in the description for Applied. If you want to buy bearings from them, that's totally up to you. I will tell you they'll probably be half the price of where you can buy them from wherever make that you're working on. Like I used to have an old Craftsman table saw, and I've probably rebuilt a spindle in that 4 or 5 times. I've had it for 37 years, and I do a lot of woodworking. And when I first rebuilt them, I called Sears. Of course, it's Craftsman saw. Called Sears for parts, and yeah, they have them. I called Applied. Back then, it was Detroit Bud Bearing. The price was half what Sears wanted. And you'll find that on any manufacturer for anything you're looking for bearings for. Drills, your hand drills, your cordless drills, bearings in your chainsaws, anything that's got bearings in it, anything that turns is going to have a bearing in it or a bushing, and they sell both. They're going to be a whole lot cheaper than the manufacturer is going to sell them to you for. I mean, if you stop and think about it, where do you think the manufacturer gets their bearings from? They don't make them. They buy them from a manufacturer that makes bearings. That's what they do. So if you need any help, you gotta comment, send it to me. I'd love to hear it. And if you want to hear some more about this, I'd be happy to go over a little more in depth, even if it's through correspondence and emails back and forth. That's what I'm here for. That's what I like to do, is help you people out. So if you have any comments, you have any questions, email me at jimsfixitshop@gmail.com. That'll be in the description below too. And I guess until then, work safe, have fun, and we'll talk to you later.